cover for you and with you. All right, so now we want to look at Joseph's administration in Egypt. Hopefully, for those of you who are objective enough, even if you're a hard sell, I've shown you enough evidence that you can buy in that this is the guy. This is who Joseph is. We've identified him in the records. We know his names. And now we're going to look at some of what he did, because think about it. If I'm right that this is the connection we should be making to who Joseph is, we've pinpointed, we've done a good job with Israelite chronology, which I haven't really proven to you. My book does that. And then Egyptian chronology, and we've synchronized them well. Hopefully that synchronization causes us to be able to see the effects, the impact of Joseph's life in Egypt. And he had a major role, so we should be able to see, because the Bible refers to some pretty monumental events that take place in his tenure as second in command in Egypt. So, shouldn't there be some kind of sign of that? Well, news, yes. The answer is yes. There are signs of his role in Egypt, and we're going to look at those now, hopefully. All right, and so that's just a reminder about my book. It's available if you're interested. $40 a copy. Cash, check, or Venmo, or PayPal, whatever your choice is. And so I'm drawing, and another reason this slide's up here, I'm drawing from the book what I packed in there. But there are some things I couldn't fit in the book, especially images, that you're going to see that are not in the book. So it pays off to be here physically together. All right, so we're going to start with this topic, grain production in the Fayum. Shouldn't we think that there may be a sign somewhere that if Joseph was appointed second in command and he was told, you need to prepare for 7 years of famine, and obviously he knew grain is what we need to survive, so we can make bread, because bread was the staple in Egypt. There were two staples, bread, oddly enough, and beer. That's it. Those are the two staples in their food, in the life of what they eat and drink. Plenty of other options, but those were the two main ones. So, is there evidence of the grain production that you'd expect to be on a massive scale so that it could provide for all of Egypt? And for those who would come to them, because we had foreigners like Jacob's family who came and bought grain from them. And think about that. I mean, what's the easiest way to make money in the United States? Monopoly. Not the game, but having a monopoly on something in society where you're the one selling all. IBM used to be have the monopoly. And then when there were other competitors, there goes a lot of their sales. So if you can get the monopoly on something, you win. You have a lottery ticket. And that's exactly what the king had. He had this monopoly on grain at the time of the famine and the preparation for it. So, and all of this is centered, it's not exclusive to this place, but the hub of where all of this activity takes place. It's called the Fayum. It's called the Fayum. And it's known affectionately as Egypt's breadbasket. So, where is the Fayum? Good question. Let's look. So this is a map. It's black and white of Egypt. It's, there's part of Egypt that's below here, but this is the majority of it that we're seeing here. So this is Lower Egypt. This is Middle Egypt, and then Upper Egypt starts here and goes further to the south. This is Sinai. Remember, we saw the site of Serbi el-Khadim, where those inscriptions are found and so forth, where the activity was to extract turquoise. So we go south, and we don't know exactly for sure where each Tawi was, but that was the capital of the 12th dynasty of Joseph's reign. So when we saw that seal, that administrative seal that said that Sa-Sobek was the controller of this city, that's the city that he was controller of, Ishtawi. And again, where Jacob is, it's right in this area here of ours. So, we're going upstream. Here's the site that's going to become really important to us, Lahum, the site of Lahum. And then here is the Fayum, right in this area. From basically from the west of Lahoun and a little bit to the north, so west and north. And that's the place that became Egypt's breadbasket. If you go on, Google Earth, and you look at a satellite view of the land of Egypt, you're going to see, you can't see it perfectly with the lighting in here and everything, but it's going to be kind of desolate, this tannish, yellowish color. That's going to reflect, lots of rock and sand and territory where people don't go. They don't live there, they don't go there. But then you see this area here on Google Earth, which is darker, much darker. So the Nile River is here. That's the Nile River to the right. And then all of this area here, that's the green habitation that comes because there is a river there that provides life around the river. And in the ancient Egyptian world, you have to know, everybody lived along the Nile River, virtually. I mean, there are oddball exceptions, oases and so forth, but other than that, everybody lives along the river. All the big cities, all the small cities, were along the Nile River. So then there's this really weird anomaly, this whole thing right here that's different colored than the desert lands to the west and east. That is the Fayum Basin. This is a lake. So in greater antiquity, let's see if I have this to show you. Well, I'll come to that in a minute. So this is kind of zooming in more. In greater antiquity, there was a lake called Lake Moors, and its original borders were like this. It was massive. And this would have been something that was, I'm convinced, a post-flood, post-biblical flood body or basin of water. And what happened is, as time went along, there was a branch of the Nile River that, there's some greenery in the Fayum, and we're going to be looking at this waterway of Joseph. But there's a branch of the Fayum, it's known today as the Bar Yusuf, that runs mostly parallel. It branches off the Nile River as it flows to the north, branches off to its left or west, and flows northward almost exactly parallel to the Nile. And it's that branch that provides the water that goes into the Fayum. And in greater antiquity, it would only dump in there in the inundation season. What's the inundation season? The Nile yearly overflowed. Its banks just broadened. And it was a mess. It made a mess for everything. But what it did is, in that process, it brought with it, in the process of becoming wider, right, and inundating the area with floodwaters, it brought with it rich minerals from the soils along the way in further south in Africa. And it deposited them so that when it receded, right, when that bloated river receded, that area where it had covered was all of a sudden very fertile ground. And that's where they would plant and be able to grow things. So that was the typical area for growth, right along that riverbank where it had created this extension, depositing all these minerals. But the Fayum is different. I mean, it was, in greater antiquity, during the inundation season, it would dump water that would rush way into the area, and it would become like a marshland. And it was uncontrolled, and it was wasteful. It was useless. A similarity in Israel, if you know Israel's history, about 70 years ago or so, I don't know the exact year, this was this kind of situation where with the Sharon Plain, it was just kind of wasteland. And they needed people who knew about water reclamation to come in and fix it and make it usable land. And actually, it's very cultivatable land in the Sharon Plain. So once they fixed the situation, the Israelis and whoever fixed all of this, it became some of the most lush, fertile land in all of Israel. And a huge part of their growth now, the vegetation, is in the Sharon Plain because they reclaimed the area. That's what they did in antiquity. So nothing new under the sun. We think we're smart in our day that we figured it out. They did it in Joseph's day. They reclaimed that land. And they had a control, they made a controlled flow of water into it. Kind of like a pipe valve. so you can stop and start and limit the amount of water that goes in. So there's not going to be an inundation, and there's not going to be, the other part of the year that becomes desolate. So it's you move controlled good water in there at a rate that's going to allow you to grow crops, and that's exactly what they did. That's the lake today. Lake Morris is a saltwater body rather than a freshwater body. So if you go there today, don't be all excited that, this is a nice, pretty lake that you can drink from. You can't. It's very high in salt content. All right, and this shows us what I was alluding to before, where you have the movement of the Nile River to the, we call it Nile North, right? It's not exactly north, but it's Nile North. It's making its way to the north. So this is Nile North as it goes along, and then right in this area, just beyond Asyut, this important city of Asyut, we have a branch off of the Nile where the regular part of the Nile goes on the right side, and this diversion, it's called the Bar Yusuf that you just saw the pictures of. The Bar Yusuf goes off to its left, to its west, and it continues to flow normally like this. It continues to flow here, and then any amount that's still surviving will dump back into the Nile here, right in this area. So, and this is that area where it would branch off and flood into the desert to the west. And so what Joseph devised is, if we can control that water flow and we can build a dike there, we can traffic in as much water as we want and we can irrigate the land with it. So that's what he did. There's a ghost town that hadn't been occupied since, I forget what dynasty. I know that in Dynasty 3 it was occupied. I don't remember if in the Old Kingdom after that it was. I don't think so. But certainly, for hundreds of years, it had been a ghost town. Lahun, also known as Kahun, also known as Il-Lahun, El-Lahun, Al-Lahun, lots of designations, but it's Lahun. There's this ghost town here, and Joseph decides, evidently, again, I'm not reading a text that says this, but evidently he decides, let's build this dike, and to do it, we're going to need manpower and time. So to do that, we need to build a city. So they rebuilt this ghost town into a modern city in the 12th dynasty that hadn't been inhabited for, I think, 9 dynasties or so, 8 or 9 dynasties. So that was a monumental feat. Now, remember this. What is the main number one job on the job description for a vizier? Build the pyramidal city of his king. So if this was Joseph, he would have built this pyramidal city for a king. We have no attested record of who the vizier is under the reign of Sesostris II. No attested record of who he is. I'm convinced, though, it's Joseph. It's just not showing up in the record so far. Maybe someday it will, but so far it hasn't. So what he decides is, we're going to build a city at Lahun, and while I'm there, I need to fulfill my number one job, which is building the pyramid and the whole city for my king. So oddly enough, at this former ghost town, out of nowhere, out of a clear blue sky, whoever the vizier is decides this, or the king agrees or decides, we're going to build a pyramidal city for the king at Lahun. No other king was buried there before, right? There are no pyramids there. Why would you choose that spot, a ghost town? Logically, makes no sense at all, unless everything centering around the reign of this king focuses on making bread for Egypt to provide through the famine. That being the case, now you have a reason for the king to be buried, to make his headquarters, if you will, not the capital per se, but to make his burial area there. Because if the vizier needs to be there to oversee the project, to build the dike, to irrigate the land, to make the grain, to provide the bread, then it makes sense that the vizier who's there would build the pyramidal city of the king there. Makes perfect sense, logically. And that's exactly what happens in history. Every Egyptologist who knows about the Middle Kingdom will tell you one thing, which is, we all know that the exploitation of the Fayum to provide for Egypt as its breadbasket began in the reign of Sesostris II. Every Egyptologist who knows the Middle Kingdom will tell you that. And guess what? Biblical chronology requires that he would be the abundance Pharaoh. Wow. What a shock, right? Surprise, surprise. So here's what we have. So just beyond Asyut and north of Dara, the Nile River branches off to the west into the Bar Yusuf. And you see that right there. That's where it takes place. Just beyond Heracleopolis, yet short of Lahoun, the Bar Yusuf turns to the northwest, into the Fayum and toward Lake Moeris. And that is this place you saw there. The Bar Yusuf flows through the Hauret Channel, and if left uncontrolled, would flood the Fayum Basin as it did during the Old Kingdom and down into the 12th dynasty. But again, Joseph is the one who created this to solve the problem of controlling water flow there. So here, this is a drawing by some French archaeologists, and it shows you once again, so this is what we saw on Google Earth, this whole Nile Basin, right, that's fertile land. There's the Nile River itself. I'm sorry, here is the Nile River itself, running to the right. This is that branch off the Bar Yusuf as it runs. And notice here, as it runs, you see this big rock here, and then you see this one here? They represent a break in the ridge. So there was a ridge, a north-south ridge in this area, right? That was higher ground, and so the water couldn't flow over it. But if left uncontrolled and there was a flooding of the river, the Bar Yusuf part of the river, like during the inundation season, the annual event, then it would dump water right through this break in the ridge. And so it would swell high enough that it would just dump right over. So that was the logical point to build the dike. And that's exactly what they did. They built the dike right where the arrow is pointing. So see the top. So the Bar Yusuf enters the Fayum Depression at about 28 meters above sea level, where it's a natural break in the ridge to the west of the Nile River. The bottom of the basin in the Fayum sits at 50 meters below sea level. One question that still remains is whether the Bar Yusuf flowed into the Fayum steadily, or whether, as some scholars believe, the flow only occurred in the inundation season when the Nile flooded in the spring. Most likely, the flow filled the plain only during the season of the Nile inundation. So that's my view, that it was only a seasonal inundation, that it wasn't a regular event. Okay, so this shows you, and I'm just going to pop through this. This shows you the irrigation channels that were dug into the Fayum itself. So look how broadly that's spread. It's allowing you water all throughout the Nile, all throughout the Fayum Basin. So you could use that to filter water all over this area to be able to make an extremely large amount of grain. And that's exactly what it was. And remember, as I said last night, for those of you who were here, this breadbasket of Egypt was used all the way into the 20th century until, I think it's 1964, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in that vicinity, when the Aswan Dam was built, and it prevented this normal process from taking place. So, so this is what Joseph did. He built the dike right in this area and allowed for water to come all throughout. Well, let's see. Oh, I'll give you a quote from a French Egyptologist, not a Christian believer, okay? Just so you know the view of a well-known, highly reputed scholar. His name is Nicolas Grimaud. Although the project was not finished until the time of Amenhotep III, so there was more of the project that continued over time. They kept improving the whole system. The presence of these great building works in the Fayum was no doubt the reason why the royal necropolis, that's where you bury the king and his family, was moved first to Dashur in the reign of Amenhotep II, and next to Lahun, right? So it's because of the great building works here that were done that we moved the royal necropolis and the king is buried at Lahun. That's why. The enormous, he goes on, the enormous task, oh, well, this isn't a quote, yet, not the next paragraph. The enormous task of exploiting the Fayum's resources, including not only farming, but also fishing, hunting, and mining, was so all-consuming that Sesostris II had precious time to devote to other tasks in Egypt. And here's the quote from Grimaud. To the first year of Sesostris II is dated a stela found at Wadi Gassus, which reports the establishing of his monuments in the god's land. And that was right before the work that begins on the Fayum and creating Egypt's breadbasket. For other events of his reign, Grimaud says, we do not have many records. In other words, whatever was going on in the reign of Sesostris II, it's kind of like a mystery to us because there's just virtually no records. Why? They were focused and busy doing one thing and one thing alone, preparing the land for the famine. And that required an enormous amount of work. So he wasn't sending expeditions places, right, to acquire minerals and so forth. He wasn't going on military campaigns to conquer foreign lands like most pharaohs did and wanted to do. No, he was busy internally getting ready for this terrible event that's going to happen, that's going to suck Egypt dry. And there's only one way to prepare it, that's to make enough grain that can last us through the entire famine. And they bought in, here's the thing, and this is awesome. They bought in to God's revelation to them that there was going to be a 7-year famine. And that took faith on their part. Couldn't they have just stood up and said, this is so stupid, I can't believe we're hearing people say this. You can't predict the future, right? How many people of our day would say that? You can't put any stock in this. But that's not how they thought in the ancient world. They were in tune with the spiritual, with that which was greater than they. And that being the case, this dream, this two-paired dream, this pair of two dreams that was one, that Joseph interpreted, that's what God needed to do to get the king to buy in. And the dream was powerful enough that it did that very thing. You know, and this is the work of God, you know, isn't it? Only God could do this. God put that dream in the king's head so that it would change Egypt's future. And in it, God was going to accomplish a great thing, right? Because if you look ahead to the end of the Joseph story, in chapter 50, when Jacob dies, what happens? Joseph's brothers freak out. They say, now Dad's gone, we're in big fat trouble. Joseph is going to come after us and take us out. And they were this, and it wasn't Parkinson's, right? They were just in fear. And Joseph pauses and he says, guys, come on. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So everything you see take place here, it's God's sovereign hand working in time and history to bring it about for a greater good. And here's what my Old Testament professor told us back when I was a student at Moody in the 80s. He said, Dr. Benware, he said, Egypt was Israel's divine incubator. Yes. It couldn't have survived outside, right? Outside the womb, in normal conditions. It had to be in an incubator. The nation had to grow somewhere where it could be protected. And Egypt became the protection for the Israelites. That's what God did, to grow them. So this is all God. God's behind it all. He's behind the dream. He's behind the exploitation of the Fayum for this very purpose. And it's all according to the things that he has determined and devised would take place for his own glory. So, again, we have Lahun here. So, the Nile River, you see flowing. The Bar Yusuf flowing. Takes the left turn when we reroute it. Joseph reroutes it into the Fayum. There's the city of Lahun. There's Hawara. That's the site right there. Hawara, I didn't tell you this, but that's the site where that factory was for making statuary during the reign of Amenemhat III that produced the kind of statuary that we see, such as the Asiatic man. That was exactly where it took place. Because now the Fayum is an important place in the later reign of Amenemhat III. But what we're focusing on is earlier in the reign of Sesostris II, when Joseph just takes over as vizier. All right, so that's the grain situation. What about the relocation of the Egyptians? Because the Bible is very clear about this. In fact, it says this, Genesis 47:21. And by the way, all the translations you see are my own translations. So you can't blame anyone else. And I can't blame anyone else if it's wrong. But my beloved Dr. Thomas, one of my Greek professors, instilled in us that the danger with standing on someone else's shoulders is that you both may fall. So I don't trust the translation to anyone else. I don't know the people who were part of the translation committee for my favorite English translation. I don't know. I don't know what they were like as people. I don't know how good they were at it. I don't know how many theological bents they read into their translation. I don't know. All I know is I was trained in Greek and Hebrew. And if I don't use it, now God can come to me and say, I have news for you, buddy. Like James said, let not many of you be teachers, for as such you incur a stricter judgment. I take that seriously. And part of that is, if I can translate the text, I'd better do it. Because I don't want to fall into a pit that someone else dug for me. If I fall, let it be a pit that I dig for myself. Okay? So that's why I have my own translation. In case you were wondering. Here we go. As for the people, he, that is Pharaoh, the king, removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. So here's my historical observation. As Barry Kemp said in his Anatomy of Egypt, and by the way, that's a great book to get if you're interested in a good book on the Middle Kingdom and a little bit beyond that. It's fantastic. And he's a great scholar, Barry Kemp. He's awesome, an Egyptologist. He says, we find it in an inclination to devise arithmetic devices for regulating economic life. And we see it in documents attempting a centralized control and direction of work and property. And it lives at Kahun, that's Lahun, in a prescription for how a complete city should be arranged. So Lahun, what he's getting at here is, it was an arranged city. Okay, there was structure to it, there was consistency to it. It's like a grid system. One of my favorite big cities in America is Chicago. Of course, I went to Moody, and so I lived 5 years in Chicago, and I love the city. But it's built in a grid system. It's all squares. I mean, there are some diagonal streets like Clark Street and so forth, but for the most part, it's all squares. And that's very logical. What accomplishes that? Does every person who moves into the city one at a time build a little bit of that for himself? No. There's a central authority behind it all, with the power, with the money, and with the will to build this grid system, right? It's got to be a strong central authority. So, therefore, the planned communities that were sprinkled throughout Egypt, beginning with the reign of Sesostris III, reflect the Egyptians' status as property of the Egyptian crown and their relocation to areas where the king chose for them to serve. This generic style accentuates their lowly position in society. So this reflects this isn't where this isn't lifestyles of the rich and famous. We're talking about simple houses in simple areas and cookie cutter. Boom, 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 boom. We have this now, these manufactured homes that are, what are they called? Modular manufactured homes. That's what you get. It's cookie cutter. It's a lot cheaper. It's less work, less intensive. And that's what we see going on at this time in history in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. Okay. So there are numerous sites that have this kind of government, and I just use the term governmental housing. That's what it's like. One is in the Fayum. It's Qasr es-Sarha. So we already saw that, this is where the Bar Yusuf is, right? It breaks through the ridge here, goes into the Fayum area, and there's Lake Karun, and that's the site right there, Qasr es-Sarha. So this is a shrine temple that was built there. But what I want to focus on is, look at this. That is the housing plan for the city of Qasr es-Sagha. How do you get that? Out of nowhere. Egyptians don't just build this for themselves, the average person. There has to be a central authority involved, and there are construction workers who are told the model for the building of it, and they follow that plan, an orthogonal plan. So there it is, the site of Qasr es-Sagha. It reflects how you have people living in governmental housing, and that is a logical outcome if it's something where the people have all sold themselves over to the king. They're the slaves to the king, and now he's got to provide housing for them. And what did the text say that we read? It said that he distributed them throughout the country. So we should see signs of this throughout Egypt. There's one. There's Qasr es-Sagha. And then we have Lahum. What happened at Lahum? There was also government housing there. Remember, this is where we have the dike that was built. So number one here, that's the pyramidal complex for Sesostris II. Remember I told you that there's a pyramid built for him? There it is, right there. His pyramid. The abundance pharaoh. And then right here we have the funerary temple of Sesostris II. And then right here we have the city itself, just as we saw at Qasr es-Sagha, this orthogonal plan, a governmental housing kind of model. And then right down here is where we have the dike, where the water makes its way into the Fayum. So this is a photograph that shows you just a little bit of a remnant of that housing. You can see the base area of the walls, two of the walls. And how are they built? In parallel as part of this system. So how does it all look? It looks like this. So picture, that's the king's pyramid, right? This would be a royal pyramid here. These would be other burial tombs. And here is the wall around the city. And here are all of these cookie-cutter homes. But we have something weird at Lahum that we don't really have at a lot of other places like Qasr es-Sagha. We have lots of cookie-cutter, small, cheap, what do we call them? Modular houses. But we also have these huge villas. Really? Yeah, right here. See these? Look how big that is. That's the wall around the villa. This is the courtyard. This is the main house. And that's how much property one person has. But in most of these houses, they have that much property. It's just a little bit of property. But then there's this string of houses. And I'm going to suggest to you that I don't know about all of them or not, but at least one of them is an Israelite house. Why? Because Joseph's family they were first here as a family. Joseph was moved here, right? He married the daughter of a priest, and then he would have moved here and had his kids here to build up the Fayum to prepare for the family. That being the case, this becomes like the home city for his family unit, his own family unit. And I'm going to show you evidence later when we look into the inscriptions that's found at Lahum, an inscription found at Lahum. That's Israelite. That's a Hebrew inscription that reflects the building of one of these. That reflects one of these. One of these villas, one of these large villas. In fact, I think I have, there it is. So here's the plan of Lahum, and these villas are right here. That's the dilapidated remains of the pyramid for Sesostris II. So this is what Joseph built. He would have walked in this area you're looking at as part of the process to oversee its construction. That's the pyramid. We don't really need to look at that. We can save our time for more important things. So I'll skip through this. These are some of the finds that go back to Dynasty II that were found at Lahum in the early part when they inhabited the area there. And this shows us that where the different kings had their pyramids built. You can't really see it from your distance. It's pretty far. The screen's pretty small. So some of the cities include Lisht and Dashur and Abydos and Hawara later for Amenemhat III. But and some of these pharaohs did have pyramids built in multiple places, but Lahun is the only place we have a pyramid built for right here, for one of the kings of the 12th dynasty. All right, question?
When you see some of these collapsed pyramids, it almost raises the question of, did they use a different building material for them than the ones that are still standing 4,000 years later?
Great question, and I don't know of any excavation reports that give us an answer to that question, but I would like an answer myself, for sure. And I wish I could give you one, but there's just no answer to give.
Are they older, like this collapsed pyramid, older than the ones, the Great Pyramids?
Younger. So the height of pyramid building in Egyptian history is the 4th and 5th dynasties. 4th and 5th dynasties, that's the height. We're in dynasty 12 here, so it's much later, hundreds of years later.
Two questions, Doug. Between the Bar Yosef and the Nile, what's the distance there on average? And were there any evidences of irrigation in that area between those two bodies of water?
No evidence I'm aware of irrigation between them. And I would say the average distance is somewhere around 10, 15 miles, 20 miles, somewhere in there. Probably that's the average. But some greater, some less. Okay. Large-scale Egyptian granaries. You would expect that if grain was made in great supply for the feeding, that you'd see examples of this in the form of silos or granaries. Okay. I'll project it. Let's see. There we go. How's that? Better? Okay. Thanks. All right. And sure enough, we do have examples of this. So, what's the biblical text that connects us to this? Genesis 41, beginning in 46b, it says this. Now Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of plenty, the land brought forth produce abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years that occurred in the land of Egypt, and he placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city, not just in one city, he placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance. So lots of grain, it's abundant, in lots of cities all over Egypt. As the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Talk about a breadbasket. That's all they were doing, growing grain. That's why the king wasn't going on military campaigns and excursions and expeditions. So my historical observation, in all of the cities of Egypt that were occupied during the time of the famine of Joseph's day, an abundant surplus of grain was stored for future consummation. That is, when the famine years would begin. One would expect that signs of these storage facilities would be left behind for the archaeological record to expose. And of course, since my PhD is in archaeology, I want to find that out. Normally, such storage units exist in the form of silos or granaries. And most silos are going to be round, but some of them are square. And in ancient history, it actually goes back much further. There we go. This is a depiction on a seal impression from Mesopotamia, all the way back to what we call the late Uruk period, which next year we're going to talk about how the late Uruk period is the timing of the event at Babel where the languages were confused and the people were dispersed across the ancient Near East. Okay, so that's the time period. Already then, we have such a depiction as you see this guy and this guy climbing up a ladder, holding something on his shoulder, right? That's weighty. And there's a building here, building here, building here. And what is he doing? He's hoisting grain to put into the silo. So this is taking place already hundreds of years earlier. And I would date this, if you want a date for it, from my perspective, somewhere between 2650 and 2600 BC. That's when this takes place. According to conventional dating, and that's one thing we'll talk about next year, more about dating, it would be around 3000 to 3250 BC, conventional numbers. My numbers, 2600 to 2650, somewhere in that range. So, all that to say, the point isn't that Joseph invents irrigation, or that he invents the concept of a storage granary. The issue is, it already existed, okay? But the issue is that Joseph's granaries were of a completely different scale than granaries before that. Because you need, what's the word for having food in advance? Prepping? No, not prepping. There's a word I'm looking for. Anyway, I can't think of it. So I was just saying, you need an inventory of ready-made grain for use, surplus. It's surplus granary. It's not what we need to use to survive this season, this growing season. We need it for surplus for future seasons. So, not a new concept, but here's one of the places where we see these enormous granaries. Lahan. Remember, we have these cookie cutter houses all here, right? Smaller ones. But we have this set of villas, at least 2 rows of these large villas. And in every one of these villas, we had a large percentage of the territory that was devoted to granary silos. So here's a look to see what that looks like, maybe a little bit more in blown up form. So here's and this is from Kemp's book. This is an artist's rendition of the official's villa, or the rich person's villa. So it would have been very nice with, he projects with trees and so forth, with columns and the inner part of the house and so forth. So this is looking at it from above, all the chambers and rooms that are part of that villa. But then look how much of it, and I don't know percentage-wise, that's what, like a third or something like that of the whole territory is granaries. So that's what we have here. This is one silo, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 granary silos in the city. That dates to the 12th dynasty. That dates to, remember, we know when it's founded, when the city's refounded. It's in the 12th dynasty during the reign of Sesostris II, the Elamites pharaoh. So it's the perfect timing for Joseph's work for all of this to take place. And this is what we get. A house with lots of granary silos. This is from the Theban tomb of Meket Ra, early in the 12th dynasty. This is a model of a granary. So it's painted wood. And you see there are little figures, little human figures, who are, have sacks or whatever of grain and are bringing it to the granary. And what you see, and so they're here. And what you see here is scribes. What are the scribes doing? They're doing the recording of it. They're monitoring how much comes in, and they're allocating grain and recording how much they're giving to Joe the Egyptian and John the Egyptian and Jane the Egyptian. Listing it all out and keeping careful records, because it was all at this point, it was becoming institutionalized. Oh, is the mic going? Is it good? It's fluctuating in and out? Do we need to do a replacement, or do we just keep going? I guess we're going to do a replacement. Question? Anyone have a question while we're in transit here?
How many miles is the Bar Yosef? How wide is it? And is what we're saying is this is a hand-dug channel. So what's the mileage and what's the width?
Wow. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers on the mileage or the width of the Bar Yosef. I've never taken it to that level. Obviously, as a builder, that's the first thing you're thinking about, and I'm not really sure. And then the other,
No,
that's it.
We built a canal from the Susquehanna River to Holiday Spur. It's 110 miles, and it's as wide as the platform.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's natural. The Bar Yusuf is natural. It was already there. He didn't have to create it. All he had to do is divert its waters into the Fayoum, and that's it. So it's just following its natural course that it would take. Yeah, it's not man-made.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know the width of it.
It doesn't matter. It's
Yeah.
not man-made.
It's not man-made.
Okay. Joe didn't have to dig it.
No. No, Joe was good. Just give me the grain. That's all I need. Give me the grain. All right. So this is multi-chambered. The scribes are doing the recording. It has access with a ladder. You see a ladder right there. And they're dumping grain into the silo from above. That's the typical model. So, assuming that the granaries at Lahoun were only 2.5 meters high, which is roughly 1 meter less than the 3.4 meter high granaries at the Nubian forts, and I'm not showing you this right now, but there are Nubian forts that are built or rebuilt, added on, by Sesostris III that have granaries, and I forget whether I'm going to be showing you this or not, but in much greater percentage of the area. Remember that Lahoun villa and what the amount, the portion of the grounds was devoted to storing grain? At the forts that Sesostris III built and rebuilt and fortified, down in Nubia, where the Africans were coming for grain, undoubtedly, because they were experiencing the same famine. Remember, it's a monopoly. This is how they became filthy rich. They could name their price from the Africans, but the Africans were coming to buy grain. So that's why he was storing grain in great quantities. We're talking like probably in some cases a third of the entire fort is nothing but silos during the reign of Sesostris III. Why? Because famines evidently continued to happen later in his reign and into the reign of Amenemhat III, his son. So there's that. So based on the city plan for Lahoun, if every home contained 6 occupants, the population would have been just short of 3,000. This means that the city could store a minimum of 3 times more grain than was required by its residents for a year's subsistence, and quite conceivably up to 10 times more grain, given roughly half of the city was left unexcavated by Petrie. So these are the numbers that Kemp gives, and if you count the part of the city that wasn't excavated, it's probably up to 10 times the amount, at least, of grain that was being produced than what was needed. That's surplus. 10 times more. Huge surplus. Why do you need to do this? Who would ever think to prepare in such a way? Only somebody who gets a message like the king was given from God. Abydos South. They have enormous granaries there. And that's located right here. So it's way upstream, Abydos South. Remember I told you that the second pyramidal city for Sesostris III was built there, and that's where he was buried? This is the site, okay? Far away from all of the action going on downriver. And so this is a drawing of, you can't see it too well, but a drawing of some of the things going on, and here's the river here, and there is a mayoral residence that was built here. A huge city and complex of buildings was built during Sesostris III's reign, and in it, it included granary facilities. And you can read about this in Joseph Wegner's book, in Joseph Wegner's article that's in a book called Egyptian Archaeology. And this article that he writes goes from pages 119 to 142. It's called Tradition and Innovation, the Middle Kingdom. And he talks all about the finds that they made. He's the archaeologist who actually dug there and explored. So I won't go through that. I'll skip that and show you some of the excavation work he did. So as of 2006, he had done excavation in these areas that you can see. And what he found was buildings that were included the mayoral residence and also lots of granaries. And then he found and excavated the first ever, we knew about this kind of structure. It's called an ararit. An ararete was a governor's gatehouse, and basically this is where all of the scribal activity took place. So this reflects a distribution on the part of the administration, the government, of something, and it would have been grain because of all the silos, to the people for their subsistence. So this reflects that description in the Bible that all of the people were under Pharaoh's control, right? They were owned by him, and they were distributed, dispersed throughout Egypt, and forced to work for him as laborers, and they were given compensation. How? In the form of grain to survive. That's all they were given. Grain and maybe water and beer or whatever, I don't know, but simple things. And they had to find a way to live with that little bit that they were given. So this is the first ever archaeological site that has an actual ararete, this place where the transaction took place between the government officials and the people. And so this mayoral residence, it's called a Perchati'ah, and that's where a representative of the king would have lived and worked. So he had a nice-sized residence, obviously way more than the peasant people. So essentially, folks, at this time, and Egyptologists don't like to admit to this, they just do not like it at all, but it's true. There was a two-class society. There was the elite, and there was the poor. The elite was under the administrative authority of the king, so his family and his aristocrats and his officials, and then there's everybody else. That's all you have. And guess what? The burial practices reflect a change in a movement toward this dichotomy and a change in society where you have this two-class society, and that's all. The rich and the poor. All right, I'll skip through this. And so granaries were located in a massive part of that complex of buildings, right? Granaries here and here to feed the people, to store the grain for this period of famine. Then Tel El-Daba also had enormous granaries, and you can see the orthogonal plan here. We can skip through that. All right, now I'm going to come to, let's see, how much time do we have left? I just need to know.
11:31.
11:31. What does our schedule say?
From now to 11:45 Q&A. So
Okay.
proceed as people.
We've done a lot of Q&A, so let's keep going, and let's give you this, and then see where we're at close to 11:45. This is really important. There shouldn't be evidence of major societal upheaval if everyone was selling himself to the king. It changed society and how it worked completely. So there should be evidence of it. It says this in Genesis 47. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Right? He bought all the land of Egypt. Talk about a monopoly. Isn't it good to be... It's like, what's his name? History of the World?
Mel Brooks.
Mel Brooks, like Mel Brooks said. It's good to be the king. Right? It is good to be the king. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, because every man sold his field since the famine was severe on them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Then Joseph said to the people, notice, today I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh. I don't know if that's rubbing it in or not, but it doesn't sound good, does it? Imagine being in their shoes. So my historical observation and kind of research question, once the famine arrived, it was severe throughout Egypt. The people of Egypt were forced to sell first their fields, then themselves to Pharaoh, just in order to buy enough grain for him to live. As we'll be seeing shortly, the priests alone were exempted from this, what's my word there? Indenturement. It's like an indentured servant, essentially, because they were provided for by the crown. However, the powerful, wealthy, and influential nomarchs would not have been exempted. Therefore, one would expect that the historical record might show clear signs of this major societal upheaval, especially related to the nomarchs, who had been leaving behind their archaeological footprint for centuries, most notably on elaborate tomb inscriptions and tomb drawings. Here's something I haven't told you about. the basic societal structure, going all the way back to the Old Kingdom, is that you had these regional authority figures called nomarchs. The closest thing in our system, governors. Or if you like, I don't know, county officials, that kind of thing. So imagine, and they had, I think at its height, there were 42 nomes across Egypt in southern Egypt, which is Upper Egypt, and northern Egypt, which is Lower Egypt. 42 in total, nomes. And in every nome, you had a nomarch. It's kind of like 42 states, and in every state you have a governor. That's the idea. Now, think about it in history of our country. Do you always find smooth, easy relations between local authorities, governors, and the President of the United States? Oh, come on. Don't they get along? Yeah, not so much. And what is it all about at the end of the day? It's a fight for power. Power, yeah. To control more than the other guy. Right? And that's exactly what you had in ancient Egypt. It's the king against the nomarchs over time in the Old Kingdom. And the king remained more powerful throughout most of the Old Kingdom, but toward the end of the Old Kingdom, it started shifting in balance toward the nomarchs. And eventually, the nomarchs, the local governors, had equal or greater, in some cases, authority than the king. And society was breaking down from within in other ways, and you had this collapse at the end of the Old Kingdom. And that brought about what's called the First Intermediate Period. It's when you have no strong central authority anymore, but it's kind of like a Wild West. And you have local government doing its thing, and crime probably increased, and, it was a mess. And the 12th dynasty represents the beginning of coming out of that. So at the end of the 11th dynasty, they're coming out of this First Intermediate Period, central authority again, and there is a reestablishment of central authority because, you know how things work over time. It's a cycle, right? As the nomarchs got the king out of control by the end of the Old Kingdom, and they thought, now we're sitting pretty, we have our state that we govern and all is good, then there's all of the breakdowns in society that can happen when you don't have a strong central authority for the entire nation to protect and preserve and have law and have, order. So now, things are worse for the nomarchs. And so they know they need a central authority. And so they kind of grin and bear it and, put a king in office, and the king takes over. But he's kind of under the thumb of the nomarchs at that point. But yet, once he was in there, and it was a familial succession, right, with his predecessor, his followers, his successors, then immediately there was that thing of, but we want more power. The king wants more power. And there was a fight to wrest control of a lot more power in Egypt from the nomarchs who had all that control. And so from the end of the 11th dynasty into the 12th dynasty, there was this fight between the nomarchs and the king. And the king couldn't gain superiority over them. They were more powerful. But all of that changed. It turned on its head during the reign of Sesostris III. Imagine for a minute that all of a sudden in our government, the states and the state governments just disappear. And there's only the president. Yeah, perish the thought. But what if it were to happen? And we were to go 30, 40, 50 years into the future, and we look back and we say, wow, what happened? I mean, we had regional control, so there was a power balance, and it was holding back the president from having this super control of the whole country and all parts of it. But all of a sudden it just disappeared. What happened to our system? What happened to governors? Imagine that there's no actual evidence of what happened, or no indication in the written record of what took place for that to happen. But something major would have had to happen societally for this, right? It's not just going to happen. The president isn't just going to find a way. Especially, I live in Texas, okay? The Texans aren't going to give up Texas without a fight. No way.
Remember the Alamo.
Yeah, you are not taking over Texas. I don't care how many guns you have. We're going to stop you, right? But imagine that there's no evidence telling us in the written record what happened. That's what happened during the reign of Sesostris III. The institution of the nomarchy ends, stops, disappears out of nowhere. How do you have a major societal structure disappear with no sign? It happened. Can you believe that? It happened. During the reign of Sesostris III. Okay, so everything I just told you, I told you so that I could skip all of this and get to a couple things to show you, and that is this. This is what Fischer writes. He's a famous Egyptologist. This is it's a German book, the Lexikon der Ägyptologie, and he has this entry on the nomarch. He says, probably the function of a nome governor, right, that's a nomarch, is as ancient as the subdivision into nomes, each of which carried a distinctive emblem. But the powers of the nomarch varied at different times and at different regions, depending on the degree of control from the royal residence, until toward the end of the 12th dynasty, reign of Sesostris III, until the office was done away with altogether. Now imagine this. You are the guy who's the Egyptologist who's writing this entry, and you're telling us that the office ended altogether. What's the natural question your audience is going to ask? Why? How did it happen? How do you account for this? Guess what? Egyptologists are at a loss to explain it. And I'm serious. They're at a loss. They can't explain it. They can't explain the major change in society. Few great local administrators of the sort that might be called nomarchs are to be found in the southernmost nomes, that's nomes, Upper Egypt 1 through 8. So they're labeled Upper Egypt 1, Upper Egypt 2, Upper Egypt 3, all the way into Lower Egypt, then it's Lower Egypt 1, Lower Egypt 2, Lower Egypt 3, right? It's just sequential. During the 12th dynasty, with the exception of Aswan, which was important as a garrison and trade center, and Upper Egypt 3, where one overlord is attested. The others are all situated in the area that had formerly been known as the Middle Nomes. The old title, Khatiyah, which was held by many of the older nomarchs as a high honorific title, now was used in an administrative sense only, as by the earlier term Meri Aa of Hagarsa, and was increasingly applied to towns, that's the German word Stadt, as mayor. At Kau, Meir, and Bersha, in particular, the largest and latest tombs clearly show the wealth and power of the Middle Egyptian governors, along with their many usurpations of royal prerogatives. With the exception of Kau, the series of great tombs of the nomarchs came to an end during the later years of Sesostris III, and the provincial administration was centralized. There it is. He's telling you a change, a major change in society. Nomarchs disappear. The whole institution disappears. We see no more tombs of buried nomarchs. Gone. By the end of the reign of Sesostris III, it's over. It's done. They're not there anymore. And again, my question is, explain it. How do you explain it? It makes no sense with the evidence we have in the world of Egyptology. It makes perfect sense if the explanation is that society turned on its head, that every person sold himself or herself to the king, except the priests. And guess what? That includes the governors. It includes them. And I'll finish with this. I'll zip forward and show you a few tombs. Can I zip? Is it letting me zip? Okay, at a site called Rika, that's really close to where we've been looking, right? This is the Fayum, right? That's Lake Karun. This is a site right here, real close by, called Rika. And at Rika, we have cemeteries. We have Cemetery A, which is where all the elite, the wealthy, were buried. And they have these shaft tombs where you drill a hole down in diagonally, way down in deep into the ground. I don't know how many feet or meters, sorry. Deep down in, and they, build the tomb down in there, and it's this elaborate stone that they haul down in and make this enormous burial chamber or set of burial chambers for the elite, right? That's in Cemetery A. And there it is. There's Cemetery A with a lot of these shaft tombs. And this cemetery clearly dates to the time between the reigns of Sesostris I and Sesostris III, the famine pharaoh, when this radical change takes place in society. Then there's Cemetery B. Cemetery B, second paragraph, lies to the south and west of A, and it consists of a large number of graves along with some shafts, most of which had been robbed out and reused down to the Ptolemaic and Roman times. So, although many of the graves in Cemetery B belong to the same period as those in Cemetery A, from the reign of Sesostris I to III, all of the large graves, that is the large shaft graves for people who are obviously important, are in Cemetery A. Engelbach suggested that grave space was reserved for some particular group, and that the poorer classes buried their dead in Cemetery B. So this is what I'm calling the other side of the tracks, the poor people, where the ground was softer and nearer to the inundation area. The rich, conversely, were buried in Cemetery A. So, this is a pit that they dug down in pit 303. And I'll skip on for the sake of time. So pit 303, this was the first pit that they opened. Considerable quantity of 12th dynasty pottery was found here. And again, Sesostris I to the III. This is large pit 302. 302 was begun when 303 was well toward completion. Plate 5 shows the chamber from the southwest, including the bonding of the stones and 4 holes in the masonry of the eastern wall, which may have been used to hold the supports of a shelf of some kind. Only small fragments of quartzite were found as probable remains of the sarcophagus that undoubtedly was lying in the chamber. Plate 6 displays 3 blocks of quartz that can be seen in the brickwork. This uninscribed tomb undoubtedly dates to Dynasty 12. Then there's pit 300 to the north of Cemetery A. And the tomb in this pit was never completed, right? They started building this elaborate rich person's tomb, and they never completed it, as many of the limestone blocks had not even been laid yet, and thus it was never used for burial. Nevertheless, the tomb area showed signs of an ancient attempt at plundering. So some idiot, after the fact, went down in here, found his way down into the burial chamber, thinking it's gold time, and he found nothing, because nobody was actually buried here at the time, with some of the flooring removed in search of treasure. The only object found was a fragment of a 13th dynasty pot resting on the floor, but that's probably of the grave robbers. So, here's what we find. Pit 300, it was never completed. Some limestone blocks were never laid. Pit 301, never completed. A brick shaft that was abandoned before chambers were cut. Pit 302, it was completed, so it probably would have been, had a burial, and then it was robbed out. So this evidently would have been before the collapse of society. Pit 303, never completed. Western wall of chamber is only, 1/4 or 3/4 finished? 3/4 finished. Pit 304, completed, robbed out in antiquity. Pit 305, not fully excavated. Pit 306, completed, and pottery only of Dynasty 12. You see what's going on here. A number of the tombs of the rich people were not even finished. Why would you do all of this elaborate work and not finish the tomb? It is absolutely illogical. But if you have the societal collapse during the reign of Sesostris III, and that's when the burial evidence dates to at the latest, you have a societal collapse, and now you have people, including the lifestyle of the rich and famous people, those guys, they can't complete the tombs anymore. They don't have the laborers because their laborers sold themselves to the king, or the wealthy person sold his laborers to the king. And then he eventually had to sell his land, and then he eventually had to sell himself. So there's no one to finish the tomb and no one to be buried in it, because now you've been transported to another part of Egypt, as the Bible says, and you live out your life as a slave to the king. This massive sign, neon signs screaming out at us, Major societal upheaval, Sesostris III's reign. Everything turned on its head. No more nomarchs. No more aristocracy. None. It all ends. Why? They sold themselves to the king. And the king owned everything. Questions? Not too bad. Yes?
Do you know what the population of Egypt was at this point?
Don't really know. Not really sure what the population of Egypt was.
Can I be totally honest about something?
Yeah.
It sounds like communism.
And the crazy part is, that's what your generation wants.
Yeah.
Isn't it bizarre?
It's awful.
Yeah.
Just build a bunch of granaries and do it now.
Yeah. Let's all just call ourselves red communists, right?
Some summaries suggest that Sesostris III was assassinated late in his reign. Is that a possibility?
Wow.
And
I've never seen that.
I was reading one last night that it suggested that he was assassinated, and then his successor, who was co-ruler, then stepped in. But that could be, if that was true, because of that tremendous societal shift that took place.
I've never heard of this, and I'm not sure what background in Egyptology this commentator has,
I don't know.
but I've never seen an Egyptologist suggest that Sesostris III was murdered. I will say this, and this goes back to the blessing that Joseph gave him. Sesostris III was revered. Sesostris III was revered all throughout later Egyptian history. Unlike anyone else. He's like the George Washington, if you will. Pick your favorite figure. Abraham Lincoln, whoever it is. He's that person for Egypt's history. In his lifetime, after his lifetime, and even in the New Kingdom, in Moses' lifetime. Still, they were making, and I'll even show you if I get to the slide later, there's an intaglio that's one of many kinds of this, that give the name Sesostris and are made in his honor to remember what he did for Egypt. So if someone murders him, it makes zero sense to me because he was so beloved. So yeah, that's the first time I've ever heard of something like that. So
Try to hunt that out.
yeah, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in that without a lot of evidence that would show me that can be true. Sir?
We're at the end, but the unfortunate thing is those people who were part of the ruling class who would lose everything and become enslaved themselves would have every motive in the world to want to kill him.
As we look at things, yes. But remember, sometimes we often look through our own lens of today, and we have to take off those lenses. In the ancient world, they were much more in tune with the mindset of their own world, which was, you don't even, Pharaoh's God. You don't think about killing a god, right? So in our day and age, maybe that would make sense. In their day and age, hardly anybody would even think of doing that. So I would say that's theoretically possible, but in reality, probably didn't happen much at all because they were afraid of the ramifications. And they had an Egyptian mindset that's called ma'at. The closest thing I can think of in our culture is karma. If you do something horrendous, I got news for you. It's going to come back to you. They had that sense, for sure. And they knew, if we even think about doing something to the king, it's going to come back to haunt us. Yeah, they'd be cursed or they would be killed, bad things would happen. So that's another reason why I wouldn't expect they would even think to do that. Yes, sir.
YouTube has it.
Oh, well.
Sesostris III escapes assassination. Again, depending on what the evidence says there.
Yeah, and I'd like to see what evidence they're presenting. And again, I haven't read anything about that. I can't say it's not true, but I can say it's questionable in my mind.
I read an English transliteration of that in this article that he wrote describing the assassination attempt upon him. And I think that, but whether, that's Google
Yeah.
or what?
Yeah. Interesting. Now you've got me intrigued. I'm going to try to hunt that down and see if there is evidence for this. All right, one more question and then we'll take a break.
Do we know how the monarchs wrested power from the pharaoh at all?
In the Old Kingdom?
In the Old Kingdom, how did
A little bit. We know a little bit about it, and it was through. Wow. Yeah, finding ways to undermine his authority, having political relations between the governor's officials and the king's officials, such that the governor's officials were always getting the upper hand. That was part of it. There was economic collapse that was taking place. So there are a lot more outside forces applied to all of this, but that's a little bit of it. Okay, so let's take a break and we'll come back at 1:30 for our next session.